Conímbriga was not the largest or most important city in the Roman province of Lusitania, but it is the best preserved and best excavated site in what is now Portugal. So let's take a look. The first thing you notice is the walls. These date to around 300 AD, at a time when this region, like much of the Western Roman Empire, was suffering from barbarian attacks and widespread instability. They were built over a large part of the early Roman city, using material from a wide range of both private and public buildings. In this area, the walls were built directly through an early imperial neighborhood of houses and shops. On this side was a small bathing complex. You can see the pili of the Hippocaust system and a small pool that may have belonged to a laconicum, the sauna. Here are the remains, more or less flattened, of two early imperial houses. We are now in the so-called House of the Skeletons, named after the human remains found here. Like most Roman houses, it had a central atrium and a peristyle. Next to the House of the Skeletons is the House of the Swastika. Like its neighbor, it's a centrally and axially planned Roman domus, dating originally to the 1st century. The garden in the peristyle has been partially replanted, which is a nice touch. It has a series of elaborate geometric mosaics. The Knot of Hercules here. On this side, the remains of a subterranean cryptoporticus. And on this side, we see the solar patterns, then quite innocuous, that gave the House of the Swastika its name. One more look along the cryptoporticus. This was essentially the basement of a commercial building, and the chambers ahead of us were used for storage. And now we head toward the center of the city, paralleling the Roman road, which connected the Roman counterparts of Lisbon and Braga. The cryptoporticus and the commercial building above it fronted on this street. As we pass through the gate, you have a sense of how substantial the late antique walls really were. They average more than 4 meters thick and are still pretty tall. They were contemporaries of Aurelian's wall around Rome, simultaneously an ornament of the city and a very important practical safeguard against an increasingly unstable world. This was the biggest mansion in the city, the so-called House of Cantaber. It was built in the 1st century AD and used continuously until the late 5th. It was modified many times, but always had an axial plan with this peristyle in the center. There were other nuclei, each with their own peristyle, situated about it. The remains of an elaborate ornamental pool here in the center. We don't know if this house actually belonged to Cantaber. He was a prominent local nobleman who was known to have been killed by the Suebi, a Germanic tribe, in the late 5th century. It's reasonable to assume that he would have owned the most impressive house in town, but we can't prove it. Beyond these geometric mosaics, you can see one of the secondary peristyles. The mosaics in these rooms are largely covered by protective plastic sheeting and layers of gravel. There were about 40 rooms in this mansion, and you have a sense, even from the foundations, of the sheer scale of this place. A private bath was added to the back of the House of Cantaber in late antiquity. Here we see the foundations and part of the heating system. Behind the House of Cantaber was another domus, which was converted, in late antiquity, into a Christian church. Ahead of us was the nave, and off to our right, the baptistry. The complex was used well into the Middle Ages, and burials were found all around it. Across the street from the House of Cantaber was the so-called Insula of the Aqueduct, a complex of multi-story housing with shops out front. Like the mansion across the street, it was used for something like 4 centuries and modified many times. Only about 10% of the city has been excavated. You can have a sense, looking toward this recent trench, of how much work remains to be done, with the ancient street about 8 feet below the modern ground level. Just beyond these well-preserved sewers, we have the partially reconstructed Forum. This was not the original Forum. That dated to the reign of Augustus, and its ruins lie beneath this space. This Forum dates to about the time that Conímbriga was promoted to the status of municipium. At its head, just in front of us, was a grandiose sanctuary of the deified emperors. Around it, framing that central temple, was an imposing portico with a cryptoporticus beneath it. These columns are modern replicas, provided to give a sense of the space and its monumentality. Here we have the foundations of the imperial cult temple, and around it, the cryptoporticus of the enveloping portico. Looking back toward the Forum, over the memorably named Insula of the Phallic Vase, with the eponymous vase unfortunately not in situ. Another small insula here in front of us, and just beyond, the South Baths. The South Baths, which date to the 2nd century, are essentially a small-scale version of the great imperial thermae of Rome itself. Here, in a courtyard that was always open, was a piscina, a swimming pool. The steps are original, but all the rest has been reconstructed. This was the central bathing block, with the usual progression of hot, warm, and cold rooms. You see here one of the subterranean spaces that serve to heat the complex. Adjoining the bathing block, and at a slightly lower level, was the palaestra, or exercise yard. It now has, and seems to have always had, a fine view of the river gorge beneath. Last, but certainly not least, the House of the Fountains, the best preserved domus in Conímbriga. Like the other aristocratic houses here, It was centrally and axially planned, with this peristyle at the heart and a triclinium beyond. The mosaics around the peristyle are well preserved and left in situ. As you can see, the house was equipped with a cryptoporticus. The mosaics are mostly geometric in elaborate abstract patterns, but there were a few figures here and there. Like this guy. Here we have the four seasons personified in the corners around a medallion with the sun titan Helios. And finally, the triclinium, where the master of the house held banquets. Looking back over the peristyle and toward the ruins of Conímbriga, Portugal's best preserved Roman city.